on Sunday morning, we are going to be having our one morning service at 10 o'clock in the park, downtown, Rotary Park Pavilion. And we're looking forward to having that day. If you know somebody who wants to be baptized, we will be having baptismal service after the regular service and our lunch. And so they can sign up online or on the paper on the table out there. So make sure you plan on being a part of that, and you'll be glad that you did. Amen. So tonight is the fifth of our 6 classes on Wednesday during the summer. Next week we'll wrap all that up. But how many of you think we've got some pretty great kids here? I think we do too. We pick up several of these kids on River Street, and some of them live over there, and they come and have a great time here. And so you guys can be dismissed. We want to thank our worship team. They did a great job. And also our production team in the back doing a great job. Amen. If you could, I want to invite you up to these first 7 or 8 tables. Being close is a better situation in that respect for teaching. And so come on up if you can and be a part of this space. Amen. Well, normally, Caleb, this class starts at 7, so I guess you get a little bit of extra time to hang out. What's class about tonight? Apologetics. Does that mean you're going to teach them how to apologize? No. Okay. All right.
Good evening. Yes, it's evening. Sorry, I'm feeling a little unwell today. So this is going to be the probably the most dense of our classes. So if I say something and it doesn't make any sense, just throw a hand up. Because like I said, this one is going to be a little bit more involved than the previous 4 weeks. And the reason that it's a little bit more involved is because we're actually going to be discussing something that's a little bit outside of the realm of what you normally would talk about in just like a normal Sunday school or church setting. We're going to be talking about apologetics. And the reason that we're talking about apologetics is if you looked at the 6-week bulletin that we put out, we're going to be talking about what we believe and why we believe it this week. And a lot of what apologetics is addressing those things about the Christian faith that most people think they understand, but they don't understand very well. All right? So we're just going to go ahead and jump right into that. And like I said, bear with me. I'm a little queasy tonight, so I'm going to try and make it through this without throwing up on you guys. And I mean that both physically and mentally, because there's a lot to talk about, and I will go down rabbit trails. So we're going to stick very close to the notes tonight. So we're going to go ahead and just open up with the first question of what is apologetics. Apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, and Peter uses this specifically in 1 Peter 3, 15 and 16. And it's very important because apologia is not just this idea of just understanding something. It is a formal term that was used in the Greek world of law. And what it means is to present a proper case or answer for a reasoned response or action. Right? So basically what an apologetic is a systematic defense of something or a systematic defense for something. Popular examples of what an apologist is outside of the realm of Christianity: if you are an avid sports fan and you defend your team tooth and nail, like some of us do with the Lions and the Tigers every year, you would be an apologist. You would just be a sports apologist. Or if you fundamentally believe that Michigan is better than Michigan State, then you are a Michigan apologist, right? You have all the reasons and the background and all that kind of stuff, and you have no problem telling everybody those things. That's what it means to be an apologist. When we talk about Christian apologetics, we're not talking about apologizing for being a Christian. We're not talking about feeling sorry that we're Christians or sorry that we're offending anybody. When we do Christian apologetics, we're specifically talking about what Christians believe, why we believe it, why that belief is reasonable, and how we can respond to the objections against our faith. This is very important because a lot of people think that they have silver bullets for Christianity, and really it's just that they don't understand the category that they're speaking in. Apologetics is a system of categories. It's not a system of communication or evangelism necessarily. It is a system of thinking. It's a philosophical system. And so it's going to be a little bit different than what we've talked about today, but it matters because when we look at the Christian worldview, which we did in the first week, and we looked at the different aspects of the Christian worldview, God and Jesus and the Bible, we've started to make some claims, right? We made some specific claims about the nature of reality, like the fact that God exists, that God created the universe, that humans were endowed with the image of God, the imago Dei, right? That we have specific things that were endowed to us because of the way that we were created. Those are all things that Christian apologists don't just stand on the claim, but they produce reasons and defenses for that claim. So when somebody comes up to you and says, well, why do you believe that God exists? That is the realm of Christian apologetics, right? So we're going to go ahead and talk through a lot of that today. I'm going to kind of break it down into what it is, how we go through it, and then I'm going to give you a couple of examples. But do note that these are very high-level examples. They're not. We're not deep diving into any specific apologetic tonight, because of the fact that you can spend 8 weeks talking about a specific apologetic and only scratch the surface. All right. But the big thing that I just want to make sure you guys know is that Christian apologetics is used to explain and give evidence to the things that we believe. Okay. A couple more things before we get into it, because this is also very important. There are a few things that apologetics are not, okay? So apologetics are not a way to win an argument. In fact, arguing is not the point, right? The Christian can win the argument and fail as an apologist. In fact, we see it a lot. We see it a lot, especially in today's culture, because people assume that just because they won the argument that they won the soul, and that's not true. The goal is not to defeat your opponent. Your goal is to faithfully bear witness to who Christ is, all right? We're bearing witness to the truth. That is the point and goal of apologetics. The second thing I want to talk about real quick is Christian faith in reason. I don't understand why this is, but there's this common sentiment in the last 150 years that faith and reason are irreconcilable and they are fundamentally divorced at their root. That is not true. Reason actually produces faith. Christianity does not teach that faith and reason are enemies. It actually teaches that they are complementary to one another. In fact, it's very important to think about this kind of thing because you can't actually reason your way out of everything. As much as I would like to say that's true, it's not. Human beings are finite. Our knowledge is incomplete. There's things that we don't understand, purposes that we do not have access to, and we do not have the ability to control outcomes the way that we believe we do, right? Faith is what steps into that and what allows us to continue to trust the Lord even in those situations, but that does not mean that reason is useless. Reason actually builds up our faith by giving us the objective truths that we can see to feel confident in those things, right? So Christianity doesn't say stop thinking and just believe, although you may have experienced a form of Christianity like that before. That is not accurate. Scripture repeatedly calls us to think carefully, test claims, to test God, and to see the things that he is saying are true, okay? We are actually specifically instructed not just to love God with all of our heart and soul, but also our mind. It's very important because the modern day Christian has divorced the idea that they have to use their mind, and that's not true, right? And that is the realm of apologetics. So we're just going to go ahead and go a little bit further into this. So I have what I like to call the 5 C's, right? These are the 5 character attributes of the apologist. And we're going to talk about this a little bit because you have to understand when you're stepping into the role of an apologist, you're stepping into a very sensitive area, okay? It's not something that we just we step into arrogantly. It's not something we step into with pride. The role of the apologist is a tender one. Okay, the command that Peter gives us to give a formal defense of our faith is actually stipulated on this idea. He says that always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason of the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. All right? There's a very popular sentiment. I've heard it preached on a lot. You can't argue anyone into heaven. That is true. But you can argue somebody into thinking about heaven. And what matters more is not what you say, but how you present it to them. Nobody cares what you know until they know that you care, right? We've heard that said a million times. John Maxwell is famous for saying that he penned that, but it's not true. But those are the things that we need to know. So when we talk about the character of the apologist, we need to think of these 5 C's. The first one is competence. This is extremely important. You need to know what you believe. You need to know why you believe it. But more importantly than those two, you need to understand an argument before attempting to use it. I want to stress this one right off the bat here because this is very important. The things I'm going to share with you tonight are not for you to go run down to Walmart and start arguing with people, okay? You will fail. And the reason that you will fail is because you're not exposed to these kind of things enough on a regular basis to actually do them well. If you want to do these things, you need to understand the argument that you're trying to make. It is extremely important. And the second thing on that is do not pretend that you possess expertise on the subject that you do not have. Especially in today's day and age with a lot of young people, nothing matters more to them than authenticity. You are never going to fake being an apologist. Okay, it's very important. But the second thing that you need to have on the flip side of that is confidence. But I don't mean confidence in the idea that I know that I'm right. You need to have confidence in your position. And what Christian confidence looks like is it's not aggression, but it's understanding that I can hear something, I can interact with something without necessarily accepting something. All right? In fact, that's one of the most important marks. Aristotle says this is one of the most important marks of an educated mind is to be able to contend with an idea without accepting its premise. Okay, so we need to be able to do that. The third thing that you need to know is that you need to have courage. This is probably more prevalent than it has ever been, especially in today's culture and age. But apologetics deals with people, right? And sometimes it's going to say things that are unpopular. The truth is not always a popular thing. But just because it's unpopular doesn't mean that you shouldn't be expressing it, right? Faithfulness requires us to occasionally speak clearly even when the answer is uncomfortable. All right, and we're going to talk about some things that might make us a little bit uncomfortable, but we'll kind of break those down and understand why that is. On the follow-up with that, you need to have compassion, right? The 4th C is compassion. One of the most important things that you will ever learn when engaging in the realm of apologetics is that you are dealing with hurt people. Okay, 9 times out of 10 when you're talking to somebody about a specific apologetic or a specific issue they have with God, they're not coming at it from somebody that is rejecting it objectively or logically. They're rejecting it subjectively or emotionally, right? People are often hurt, and that's why they associate their wounds with rejecting God. Okay, you can't make an argument for the existence of God on the moral basis for somebody that is struggling with dealing with the fact that they have had a great hurt happen in their lives, right? You need to understand who you're dealing with and how you're dealing with it, because a lot of those questions often are connected to doubt, pain, disappointment, anger, or loss, right? And we need to be sensitive to those things when we do those things. That's the reason that Peter tells us to do it in all gentleness, okay? And then the last thing is creativity. Not every apologetic will always be operated in the same realm or environment all the time. Sometimes people don't need to hear certain apologetics. Other times they might be asking about something from a more educated perspective than you have. A great example of this is Paul when he's talking to the believers, or the non-believers, in Acts 17 and also in Acts 13 when he's talking to the Jews, right? He approaches it differently because he doesn't have to start at the same place. Okay, so we'll look at those a little bit, but I want to we'll talk to you about one more thing here real quick, and it's this idea of thinking apologetically. Like I already mentioned, apologetics is not something that we just simply do. It is a way that we think, right? It is a philosophical system, and if you want to operate in a philosophical system, you need to be able to think philosophically. Does anybody know what philosophy means? Does anybody want to take a stab at what philosophy means?
Different perspective on purpose?
Different perspectives on purpose. Philosophy is basically, in layman's terms, philosophy is how we think about things. It's thinking about things. That is essentially what philosophy is, right? And there's a lot of different philosophies, but there's actually a specific way that people are trained to think, and they're trained to think philosophically. And apologetics does the same thing. You need to think apologetically. So there's a couple of things that you need to do when you approach an apologetic. The first thing, and this is the most important thing, is you need to listen. You need to understand what the person is actually asking when you approach apologetics. Do not answer the question that you wish that they had asked. All right, I know it seems kind of funny, but it is very true. We do this so often. We talk past each other rather than talking to each other. The most important thing you can do in apologetics is listen, because you'll find the underlying root cause of the question. Right? The second thing is identifying the claim. This is very important. You need to ask the question, what are they specifically claiming? Right? A great example of this is the idea that people will say science disproves God. All right, that statement is not a complete argument. In fact, it's just an ignorant thing to say. Right? First of all, what do you mean by science? What do you mean by disproved? What do you mean by God? Right? All of those things are incredibly important to this conversation, but you need to understand what they're specifically claiming. Because if you were talking to an atheist and they say, well, science disproves God, what they're really saying is what I have learned, right, specifically invalidates the Christian God. That's the claim that they're making. And that actually, what they've provided actually has nothing to do with that. The third thing, is you need to identify the assumptions on both sides. This is important. Every time we talk about something, no matter what it is, we bring in our own presuppositions and assumptions about what we're talking about. Okay? So when somebody brings up an idea or a thought or a question, we not only need to identify what they're specifically claiming, but we also need to identify what is the groundwork for that question. Right? This looks like what has to be true for the argument to actually work. Right? We just talked about that a little bit, but one of my favorite ones is that there's no evidence for God. You know, people will say that there's no empirical evidence for God. You can't see him, touch him, taste him, smell him, that kind of thing. But what's interesting about that statement is it smuggles in a presupposition that empirical evidence is the only evidence that is valid. Right? And what's very interesting about that is that you can't rationally justify the idea that only empirical evidence exists. If you did, you would have to throw out about 80% of all scientific studies, like geology and forensics and history itself, right? Because you can't see, smell, taste, or touch those things, right? They're based on what came before, right? They're evidential, right? They're not empirical. So that's a very important. The other thing is that you need to think about the worldview that you're interacting with. Somebody who has no concept of God, right, or has no concept of the church in general or what they teach, will not be able to respond theologically if you bring up a theological question. Right? They will respond naturally or in a naturalistic sense. They won't sit there and say, oh, yeah, you know what? This really stirs something in my soul, because they don't have the words for that. Or another example of that is if you run into somebody who has a naturalistic worldview, they believe that all of the universe is just what it is, it's just matter and everything's a mistake, they will not accept the supernatural by default. And the reason they won't accept the supernatural by default is because they don't have a category for it. So they deny it. And you need to understand those things when you get into apologetics. Because you can have a great conversation about the cosmological argument and the necessity for a creator in the universe, but you can't have a great conversation about the importance of the apologetic based on personal faith. Right? You'll lose them in translation, so to speak. So it's very important that we identify the assumptions and pre-assumptions that we're bringing. Also, the ones that we're bringing. Right? We could be very confident about certain answers that blind us to what their person is actually asking. All right, and one of the dangers of this when it comes to Christian apologetics is that we oversimplify things for the sake of necessity. It is very hard to explain to somebody in 5 minutes on the road why evolution fails as a model for life. Okay? And sometimes we will try and make that argument and just assume that they know what we know. And that's a very bad way to go about this. The last thing that we need to do, I say the last thing, but it's not entirely the last thing. The next thing that we need to do is examine the conclusion. A lot of people start with their conclusion first. In fact, based on just a few simple questions of help me understand that or why do you believe that, you can find out where somebody ends long before they actually get there. A great example of this is the idea that people will say many religions exist. This is true, but it's a non sequitur. It does not follow, right, that none of them is true. Right? Just because we have a lot of something doesn't mean that one of them specifically isn't true. Right? But a lot of people will jump to the conclusion just based on their limited understanding of things. And again, we do this too. That's why it's very important that we recognize what we're talking about and we understand it very well and we understand the areas that it does not cover. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The next thing that you need to be able to do is understand your own argument. And what I mean by that is you need to know what your argument establishes, what it can hold, and what it does not hold, because not every argument is created for every purpose. In fact, apologetics are very specific, okay? I can't have a conversation about the creation of the universe and just leave it at that, because I may be able to prove, right, with a logical degree of certainty that the universe requires a creator, but that apologetic does not get me to, so Yahweh created the universe. All right? It just gets me to intelligent design. Does everyone understand what I'm saying so far? I'm not losing anybody? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not looking up as much as I usually do. But here might be the most important one out of all of them, and this is the last one. It is okay to say, I don't know. A lot of people assume that when you don't have the answer to something, that it is a concession or it is a point against you. That's not true. You can answer honestly and just say, I don't know. And then I like to follow that up with, but I'll find out.
Yes.
Okay? And the reason that this is important is because an honest, unanswered question is far better than a confidently bad answered question. I know some people really think that no answer is worse than having a bad answer. That's not true. Having no answer is better than a confident bad answer, because a confident bad answer might set that person up for failure later on down the line. All right? And we don't want that, because you never know if you're going to get to interact with this person again. So you want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence when you do this. All right, let's talk about the prime example of apologetics in the Bible, and that's Paul. We're not going to go into this too much, but I do want to stress the fact that we actually do have a template for apologetics in Scripture. Paul actually very often uses this formula, but in Acts chapter 17, this is where it is outlined the most specifically, and he does some pretty specific things. So the first thing that he does before he opens his mouth is that he observes. Scripture tells us that he is standing there and he's watching them. He's watching the Epicureans. He's watching the other people sit there and debate. And he's watching what they do and what they interact with. He's observing them before he ever speaks. It's very important to know who you're talking to. Amen? The next thing is that he notices the idols. He notices the things that they're interacting with. He notices that there's one specific altar dedicated to the unknown God. That is his hook. That's his in. That's his apologetic. He recognizes something about them that he can actually interact with. Okay? But the one thing that he doesn't do, and you'll notice this, is that he doesn't immediately take that altar to the unnamed God and immediately attribute it to somebody. He doesn't immediately say, I know who this is, you need to listen to me. He begins asking questions, right? The greatest answer to any question when it comes to apologetics is a question. But you don't always have to speak that question, all right? Sometimes it's asking yourself, what is the assumption? What is the baseline? What am I contending with? Right? Other times it might be, well, help me understand that, or can you explain that, or why do you believe that? And that's what Paul did. And from there, he works through it, right? So he goes, okay, so this is what you guys have. This is what I'm observing. You've helped me understand your perspective. Now I'm going to tell you what this is, right? Then he goes right to the list, that God created the universe, that he sent his son Jesus Christ, the God that you worship, right? The unnamed God is actually this person, okay? And he specifically goes through this whole list of things, and he gives an apologetic witness to these people about this, and he goes through the whole thing. But one of the most important things about this is, if you actually look at the end of the story, what's very interesting is that most people reject him. In fact, they laugh at him. That's an important thing about apologetics that you need to understand too, is that not everybody is standing on the same. Not everybody is standing on the same understanding of the topics that you're talking about. Okay? You can talk about something very deeply to somebody who only thinks very shallowly, and they're going to have a hard time comprehending where you are, right? But what's very interesting is this is the prime example of apologetics in Scripture, but it doesn't say that Paul failed. It actually says that a few of them came and said, we would like to talk about this again, right? And so what it did is it opened the door. And that's very important. The other great example of this is in Acts chapter 13, when Paul is coming back, and he's actually talking to the Jews at this point, and he does something radically different. He starts with what they already know. He went straight to the Old Testament. He went straight to the prophets. He went straight to all of the signs of the Messiah and then preached Jesus Christ. That's what he did, right? Contextualization is not compromise. In fact, Paul makes it very clear when he says to the Jew, I became a Jew, to the Greek, I became a Greek. Contextualization matters. But the important thing about contextualization is not that he watered down the gospel, it's just that he changed the format in which he was giving it, right? And if you're at any point ever in apologetics or evangelism watering down the gospel, you have failed. All right? Because the gospel does not change, just the method of delivery, right? Okay, so it's very important that we understand that. That's why we saved apologetics for the end, because it's important that you have the foundation before you walk. You need to have the who before you go and do the do, okay? So very important. Apologetics communicates an unchanging Christian truth from the starting point to the listener in a way that it can understand it, all right? It does not serve you any practical purpose to sit there and talk over somebody's head if they're not understanding you. That's why we ask questions, all right? And very important. So, now that we've talked about the different things about what it means to be an apologist, what apologists do, what we don't do, the things that we're trying to accomplish, let's actually talk about what apologetics actually do, okay? So there are different apologetic arguments and different answers to those arguments, right? They are meant to address a specific thing that has been brought up. There is no single argument that proves the entirety of Christianity, okay? That's why we have a lot of them. For example, the cosmological argument may show that the universe depends on a creator being, but that does not prove that it is the Christian God. Okay? It doesn't. A teleological argument may prove that there is intelligent design, but it does not prove the Trinity, right? Apologetics is a toolbox to help people come to a conclusion, but it does not actually give them all of the answers, right? That's the reason that faith and reason go together. Another good example of this is that the moral argument may provide reasons to believe in objective morality, but it does not necessarily speak to biblical inspiration or how we believe the scriptures, right? Or even more importantly, it doesn't always make us feel good about it. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the moral argument because there's a lot to unpack there. But what we're trying to do, and what we're trying to do in Christian apologetics is build a cumulative case, right? And this is kind of like a courtroom, right? It goes back to that courtroom analogy. We're not providing one single evidence. We're providing a consistent baseline of evidences that says that you cannot ignore all of these truths, right? You can't. You might disagree with one specifically, right? For example, some people might sit there and say, well, I don't necessarily know if I agree with the cosmological argument based on XYZ grounds. And you could say, okay, but the fact of the matter is that this is still an educated and well thought out response to your claim, and I have one and you don't, right? That's important because we're building up a cumulative case. You might disagree with the specifics, but the overwhelming amount of evidence to these things speaks to the truth, okay? Yes?
On the way to church tonight, because sometimes people would think, well, how is this going to come up in the real world? On the way to church tonight, Ellie says to me, she says, Papa, she said, the wildfires up in Canada. I said, yeah. She said, well, if God made it rain, wouldn't he be able to put the wildfires out? I said, yeah. And then she said, well, why doesn't he?
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about natural theology here in just a second. But yes, that is a great example of that because those are the kind of questions that we need.
And that's for the 9-year-old.
Yeah, and if you can't explain it to a 9-year-old, you're not going to explain it to a 27-year-old or a 35-year-old or somebody who might be more educated than you. Okay? So it's very important, and this kind of leads into my last point about the cumulative case, is a good apologist understands not only what their argument establishes, but also what it does not establish, right? Or more to the point, a good argument understands what it can claim and what it can't claim, right? For example, a teleological argument is never going to answer Ellie's question. A case for the resurrection is not going to answer Ellie's question, but the case for natural evil will answer her question. So you have to use the right tool for the job, okay? All right, next thing we're going to do is talk about natural theology. Now, we talked about a little bit about this the other night with natural revelation in our last class, if you remember, talking about the things that we can observe in nature that point to God. Well, natural theology is a system of theology that attempts to reason towards the truth about God via creation, human experience, and reason, right? This is, it's also known as philosophical theology, right? But natural theology is the idea of we're taking our experience, we're taking what we know, and making educated guesses about God, okay? So, here's a question for you, and this is just something that we can think about for a moment. Can we reasonably conclude anything about God based on reality or our experiences? If you were here last class, the answer should undoubtedly be yes. But we can. We can make informed opinions about who God is based on the reality and the nature of reality. For example, and this is a fun one if you ever think all the way through it, one of the hallmark things about what we know to be true about intelligence is that intelligence naturally creates things, right? Your computer, when you sit at work or you sit at home, right, it runs and it is extremely sophisticated, right? But it is only because a sophisticated mind put it together, right? If you just left all of the components for a computer in a room together, it would never naturally form a computer. And it just wouldn't. Some people like to say if you were given an unreasonable amount of time, it potentially could, but that's actually just a very poor defense for something. It's not true. Thank you. It will never naturally do that on its own because it's not designed to. But if an intelligent mind comes in and puts those things together, it will do things that it's designed to do, right? It's the difference between hardware and software. It's very important that we understand these things because there are specific arguments that we can infer from the nature of reality, and then there are specific arguments that we can infer from physical observation, things like that. So the first one that we're going to talk about are a posteriori arguments. I hate that word, a posteriori arguments. These arguments begin with something that is observed from reality. For example, the universe exists. That's where the cosmological and teleological arguments come from. We understand that people are held to some level of objective reality. We also understand that people have the same intrinsic objective morality, right? And so that's where like moral arguments come from, religious experience. I'm trying to think of just a few more off the top of my head. The concept, there's an apologetic for the beauty, for beauty in nature. Beauty should not exist, and yet we recognize it as something that exists, right? So there's an apologetic based on there. There's an apologetic for logic, just in general, the idea that we are rational creatures, therefore there must be a rational mind behind it, things like that. And then we have a priori arguments. These are arguments that primarily refer to reason rather than a physical observation. These are the more intrinsic ones, and these are the harder ones, in my opinion, to really nail down, because these are the ones where people do a lot of categorical shifting. And what I mean by that is that people will start bouncing between subjective and objective, or truth and non-truth, or power narratives or objective reality. They'll start moving between these things without recognizing that they're doing it. And it's very important that you recognize those things, because sometimes people will make an argument against something in a way that their worldview or their argument can't uphold. For example, if we're having a conversation about whether or not there is an objective truth, and somebody objects based on the idea that I don't like that truth, right? That's categorical shifting, because you've shifted into a moral framework rather than an epistemological framework, and they're not compatible the way that people try and make them to. All right, examples of a priori arguments are the ontological apologetic. That the ontology is the study of why things are, right? It's the study of purpose, the study of things like that. This one also covers a few other ones that I don't want to get into them too much because they're a little bit confusing. Like the ontological argument, the moral arguments, some of them that fall into this category. But the important thing is that they're based on using reason rather than the objective nature of something. So this is something that we start with a thought and then move to the conclusion. The other one is we start with what we experience and then move to the conclusion. Okay? So natural theology finds reasons from creation and human experience that point toward truth and to the Creator. But they do not always give us the whole thing, and that's why we have a cumulative case. Important things about this and about apologetics in general. Natural theology is not going to give you the gospel, right? So when we talk about apologetics, it's very important that you understand that this is not the baseline. This is the craft that you use with the baseline. You need to know the gospel. You need to know who Jesus is. You need to know these things. Because creation may point towards a creator, but it does not tell you who the creator is, right? It does not independently tell you, for example, that Jesus of Nazareth died for your sins and was risen again and now has ascended to the right hand of the Father and is coming back again, right? You're never just going to naturally learn those things. That's why it's important to understand that what natural theology is and how we use it. Is everyone on the same page right now? Any questions, comments, concerns? No? All right. Let's jump into a few of the actual arguments. So I'm going to talk about 3 arguments tonight. And I'm going to go pretty in-depth with these 3 arguments. But I am by no means expecting you guys to remember all of this. I'm not quizzing you at the end. And I also don't expect you to be able to walk out of here and use them confidently, okay? I'm trying to expose you to them so that you have an idea of what they are. And if you'd like to dig deeper into them, we can actually go ahead and do that, okay? So the first one we're going to talk about is the cosmological argument. This is one of my favorite arguments for the existence of God. And it asks the big question, why does something exist rather than nothing? Right? The reason that I like the cosmological argument so much is it starts at a baseline that cannot be denied. Right? Science has confirmed, and I say that with a big asterisk because science doesn't confirm things, but that's not the point of this. Scientists believe, and they can show empirically now, that the universe had a beginning. Right? There is no infinite regress. There is no infinite future. The universe had a beginning, and it is actually flying at a massive rate towards heat death. The universe will end. We know these things. Okay? What the cosmological argument does, though, is it begins with the idea of existence, but does not simply ask, well, why is there existence? It asks the underlying questions of, why does anything at all exist? Right? Especially because we understand that much of the universe is contingent. Right? A contingent, what I mean by that is creation itself is contingent on a creator. Right? And we see this in the natural world. We see this in pretty much everything that we experience. We know this. Anything that began to exist must have a creator. We all come from something. The stars are contingent. Planets are contingent. It all came from something. The problem is that scientists also say very confidently that before the universe began in what they call the Big Bang, there was nothing. Right? And this goes into Newton's 3 laws of thermodynamics. And the basic concept of this is very simple, that nothing cannot produce something.
There you go.
We know this. It's not some kind of fantastical thought. It's common sense, if you will. And it's not something that is actively denied. But what the cosmological argument does is it actually moves a little bit deeper into that. And it begins to explain the idea that, well, if there is something, right, and it came from nothing, then there must be something outside of that nothing that created something. Right? And that is where we get the argument of contingency from. Again, contingency specifically says that there has to, if something depends on its existence from something else, then there must have been something else to begin with. Now, on week 2, when we talked about God, we talked about God's aseity. Does anybody remember what aseity means? That's okay. Aseity is the word that we use to describe God's self-contingency. God is not caused by anything, and he is perfect within himself, not as a created being, but perfectly fulfilled in a way that he does not need anything or nothing to provide for him. He simply is. That's why when he spoke to Moses and he said, I am that I am, he did not say it in the idea that I am something and I will be something. He is just saying I am. Right? He simply exists. He is not contingent on anything. In fact, if God was contingent on something, then whatever he was contingent on would be God. It wouldn't be him. All right? And what Christian theology specifically does, and the Christian apologetic for the cosmological argument specifically does, is it says that God is the necessary component for existence. Right? So what this argument is basically doing is saying something had to be there to produce the universe. We're saying that it is God. right? That's the cosmological argument in a nutshell. All right, and then what it basically breaks down is the doctrine of aseity, and that's why you need to know those kind of things. Here's the column theological argument, and this is the second part to the cosmological argument, and it is simply this, and it might seem like semantics, but it's very important. Column specifically makes three claims, right? Whatever begins to exist has to have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. All right, it's very simple, but it's very important because whatever begins to exist is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that. Because again, as we already pointed out, God did not begin to exist, God exists, right? A common objection to this apologetic, these are the things that people will often argue about. Well, who created God? Again, we just talked about that, and I'll continue to reference that. God was not created by anything. If God was created, whatever created him would be God. Right? And then you fall into an infinite regress. The only way that the universe logically makes sense is if God exists purely because of himself. Okay? Does everyone understand that? Okay. The second one, this is also very important before we move on to that one. This argument does not make the claim that everything has a cause, and I pointed that out already. This argument specifically makes the claim that the universe had a cause, and the God of the Christian Bible, who does not have a cause, is that cause, right? That's why it's very important to understand the specific things that we're actually claiming. Because if I just said, well, the universe began, therefore it has to have a creator, right? It opens the door to the idea of, well, who created the creator? Right? And that's not a complete apologetic because it denies the idea that God is, he has aseity, that he is perfectly complete in himself. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's why I said these ones are a little bit more in depth, and you need to specifically understand the claims that you're making and what you're not making. Because when it comes to the cosmological argument, I'm not making the claim that God was created, right? And you have to be very specific about how you word these things. The second one is the teleological argument. Telos means the end, right? I've talked about that before. I've used it in sermons, things like that. But it refers to the end, the purpose, or the goal. So teleology, right, or the teleological argument, more to the point, is the argument that we see order and we see structure and we see intelligibility and life-permitting characteristics in the universe. Therefore, they must have been there on purpose, right? Because they would not just happen randomly. Another modern form of this is often referred to as the fine-tuning argument. You may have heard that. When we talk about cosmology in general, one of the things that's very interesting is that scientists label the area that the Earth exists in, and they call it the Goldilocks zone. Does anybody know the story of Goldilocks? You know, the porridge was too hot, it was too cold, this one's just right. Well, that's what the premise of the Goldilocks zone is. The Earth sits in a unique position in the cosmos as the one area that is life permitting. And there's actually, they continue to add different things that they say quantify what is life permitting. But right now, there's about 96 of them. And you would have to have all 96 of these things in order for life to exist. Well, you find that exclusively on Earth. Okay, and so the teleological argument makes the argument of fine-tuning. It is so fine-tuned and so compatible with complex life, and what I mean by complex life is more than single-cell organisms, even though, to be fair, we have not even found single-celled organisms anywhere in the universe because the universe is inherently hostile to life, that it must have been done by somebody who designed it, right? It does not say that God specifically designed it. It does not say that the Christian God specifically designed it. The argument is merely making the case that somebody had to design it. Okay? So, 3 explanations for fine-tuning. There's three reasons that people will give. They will give necessity, they will give chance, and they will give design. Just a small caveat on intelligent design. Intelligent design is a very well thought out and very academically scrutinized belief system. It is also constantly under attack because it violates the core tenets of scientism. Okay, if you accept the idea that there is an intelligent design or an intelligent mind outside of human understanding, you open the door to a can of worms that their worldview cannot handle. So intelligent design is often attacked by people of the academic community. They won't even listen to you when you bring up the idea of intelligent design. If you would like to know more about intelligent design, though, I recommend any of Dr. Stephen Meyer's books. Who?
He's out there.
Oh, Duran?
Ron already left, or
Yeah.
is he outside?
He might be in the back room.
So that's just an important thing to know. But here's some important things. The universe possesses and super impressive laws of physical and metaphysical natures, right? And those laws are specifically compatible with human life on our planet, right? So that's the important thing. So the question of this apologetic is not just the idea of was it fine-tuned, but which explanation best accounts for the evidences that are provided, right? Necessity. Well, the problem with necessity is that it implies that the universe has to exist, right? We already addressed that in the cosmological argument, but the simple matter of this is that the universe does not insist upon itself. And what I mean by that is that nothing in creation points to the idea that creation has to exist. Therefore, the argument of necessity really just kind of falls flat on its face. Nothing necessitates the idea that life exists. The second one is chance. This one is a slippery slope for a lot of different reasons, because theoretically, if you gave enough time to anything, technically anything is possible. The problem with that is that it's just simply not true. And a great example of that is random number generation. Random number generation, or RNG, is what computers use to extrapolate models and predict the idea of chance. Here's the interesting thing about random number generation. It's not truly random. And the reason that it's not truly random is because there's no agency assigned to the computer. It doesn't have an intelligent mind to actually do that. The confines of mathematics limit it from the idea of being truly random. Therefore, when we look at the idea of chance and random generation of things happening, it's not truly random. And the second thing about that is that there's not a truly infinite time span. Again, we know that the universe had a beginning. You can't deny it. We also know that the universe is going to die. It's like 500 to 50,000 years from now. Don't worry about it. But we do know that it has a logical endpoint, right? It is not an infinite regress back and forth. Therefore, the idea that this all happened randomly by chance is so infinitesimally small, right, that it cannot be reliable. If you're basing the idea that this is on chance, you have far more faith than I do. Okay? So that leaves us with design. When we look around and we see that everything is perfectly placed, I mean, without spending too much time on this, things are so perfectly placed that if the axis of the Earth rotated even 1 degree off of its predestined axis, and the axis does change as we rotate around the universe on purpose, I might add, around the sun. If it was even to go 1 degree in one direction or the other, we would either spontaneously combust and all die, or we would instantly freeze within 24 hours, and life would cease to exist on this planet. Okay, that does not happen by accident. It does not happen by chance, and it is not necessitated by anything other than our need, right? And we certainly did not create the universe. Therefore, the most likely explanation is that a mind, an intelligent mind, put this into place. Now,
Caleb, what if somebody says, well, there are billions, maybe trillions of stars and planets, and it had to have happened, it could have happened by chance because there are so many, this could have just happened by chance, and that there could be other places where this also exists.
so what basically what they're trying to do at that point is that they're trying to make a claim to the gaps, right? And we're going to talk about this right here now. The claim to the gaps is very important. What it's basically saying is although we cannot prove this, right, it must have happened because there's so much chance, right? The problem with that is, as we just described with chance in general, is that even with the sheer amount of available data to us, right, and all the things that we can observe and all the things that we know about the cosmos and all the things we know about the different planets and things like that, and like I said, I think it's 96 right now, different specific requirements for life, right? They can't find anything that has even one of those things. So the problem is, and this is the problem with chance in general, is the idea that if given enough time, given enough resources, given enough data, it must happen. Well, that's appealing to the gaps, We don't know if it's out there, but we're not going to dismiss it because potential. The problem with that is the more and the more that we find about the universe, the more and more that we see, the number continues to shrink. Again, it's so infinitesimally small that you can't realistically rely on it. The last time I saw the number, and I'm trying to remember this, it was like 10 to the, it was like 26 or 27,000th power, right, on the chance of this actually happening. I mean, we're talking about zeros for miles, right? The idea that life could exist somewhere else, right? So when we ask the question, we could say, yeah, it's possible, but what does the evidence point to? Well, the evidence does not point to the idea that it happened by chance, right? Because again, the chance of it happening is so low. You know, you have a greater chance of rising from the dead, right, which we actually do have historically verified accounts of, right, than the idea that there's life somewhere else. And is also, the other thing is too, is they're looking for it. People spend a ton of time and a ton of money looking for these things, and they've yet to find anything. So I'm not saying anything with 100% certainty. What I'm saying is the evidence does not point to that. It points to something different. Does that make sense? Okay. And again, that's why when we look at this, we look specifically to the idea of the better argument for this is not that, oh, we have options, therefore we can choose one. It is which explanation best accounts for the evidence that we have. Okay? So that is the teleological argument. Any other questions? Okay. Now we're going to get into the big one. This is the moral argument. And I'm going to spend a lot of time really breaking this down because there's actually a lot of components to the moral argument. But the moral argument is basically the question of why are some things actually wrong? Okay? The moral argument begins with our experience of moral obligation. We all have moral obligation. We do know that there are certain things that are just objectively wrong. We can deny them if we want to, but we know that they're objectively wrong. For example, we do not say, I dislike murder. We say murder is wrong, right? And we agree to that. It's something that we know. Okay? So, and that's important because it sets up this entire idea, and there's a lot of different arguments for morality. But the first one that we need to do is establish what objective morality is, right? And objective moral truth remains true regardless of personal or cultural approval. And this is kind of important because a lot of people like to shy away from this because it holds us accountable to things. The important thing when you talk about morality is that you don't let people shift in and out of categories and you don't let them off the hook. You literally hold them down and make them speak true to their worldview. Just as an example of this, I had a conversation with one of my brothers one time about morality. And he made the claim, well, that moral standards are just part of human evolution and we all just agreed on the same things. And I said, well, that's not true. And I gave an example. And the example was the Holocaust, right? When after the war, right, and the Allies won, they got together and they had the Nuremberg trials, right? And in Nuremberg, they made a very specific claim that we all understand to be true, and it's simply this. The Germans were saying, well, we're just following orders. This was coherent with our worldview. You can't judge us. And the rest of the world got together and said, no, that's not true. You have committed crimes against humanity. We recognize objective moral truths. We recognize objective moral standards. You did not have the right to take their lives. Right? Now, in 2026, that is once again being argued, but the fact remains there is an objective moral standard, right? It does not matter if a government approves of it. It does not matter if society normalizes it or a majority votes for it. We understand that we have certain inalienable rights, right? You have the right to life, for example. Nobody is allowed to just take your life, right? We understand those things to be true, and that is the basis of objective morality. The question becomes, where does that come from? Where does the moral objective, right, or the moral imperative, if you will, where is it grounded in? And that is the basic moral argument. The basic moral argument can be broken down into three parts. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not possess an adequate and ultimate foundation. Basically, what it's saying is, if God doesn't exist, there's nothing good enough to bind the entirety of humanity into an objective moral value. The second thing, we understand that objective moral values do exist. We have them, right? We might, play a little fast and loose with them, but we all know that we have them, all right? So, therefore, as it follows, the existence of objective morality provides a reason to believe in God. It does not say that God exists, it provides a reason to believe in God. So, here's a question for you, since we're talking about this. Can atheists be moral? Yes, I have a yes. Anybody else? Not true atheists? All right, help me understand that one. Okay. I'm not going to get too much into the labels, but technically you are correct. The idea of an atheist as presented by an atheist is not true. They believe in atheism, which is the idea that God just does not exist. Right? That is a worldview, that is a belief system. But can an atheist be moral? The answer is yes. And it's not, this is what I believe. No, the answer is just purely yes. And the reason is because they're human. Okay? An atheist can recognize things like murder is wrong. They can recognize things like that behavior is inadequate. They can recognize things like this is my property, you're not allowed to take that. The problem is that they do not have the right philosophical and moral language in their worldview to express those things. Okay? When we talk about apologetics, one of my favorite things to do, when I'm actually having a conversation about this with somebody, is to recognize what they're stealing from my worldview. Right? When it comes to the argument of morality, it's very important that you understand that every worldview, every human worldview steals morality from a Christian worldview. And the reason that they steal it from a Christian worldview is because our worldview is founded on God. All right? So they attribute moral language to things that they do not have the proper access to, for lack of a better term. For example, have you ever heard somebody ever say, well, this is my truth? Right? That's stealing the concept, the epistemological concept of what truth is. Because in their worldview, they have no language to actually speak to what truth is. The same thing is there is no objective truth. The irony of that statement is that it is an objective statement. Okay? But they actually can't wrestle with that. They can't think through that in their worldview because they do not have the language for it. Therefore, they borrow it. And it's very important when you're witnessing to somebody that you call that out. Because a lot of people don't realize that they're doing it. Okay? So that's the cultural differences. There's also evolutionary explanations for morality. Some people will like to argue that morality has just naturally come about as human beings understood that we are stronger together and therefore we have to make concessions. In my apologetics class, we did a debate and I got to be the atheist, and this was one of the arguments that I used against Christianity. I said that morality could happen without your God. And what the apologists did not do in that debate is they did not narrow down the claim of what do I mean by morality, right? Because you can't explain moral psychology without understanding that there is a grounding moral truth. And when I made the claim that I can have morals without God, I was making the claim that I can have my cake, right, without acknowledging where the cake came from. And they didn't call that out. And guess who won that debate? It was me. I won the debate. Yes, the atheist won that debate in a Christian college. Now, I'm not going to toot my own horn, but the reason that I won that debate isn't because my arguments were better than theirs. It's because I understood their arguments better than they did. Right? I knew exactly where Christian arguments started to falter, and I also knew who I was debating against. My wife was on the Christian team. Okay? I understand intimately well that Eva does not like apologetics. It makes her head hurt. So I hit her where I knew it would hurt. Okay? I asked shallow questions, and this is very important when we talk about apologetics. Shallow questions cannot have shallow responses. Okay? Because a shallow question of, well, why does it have to be the Christian God? Right? Is actually a surprisingly deep question that involves a lot of different things. Right? It involves epistemology, it involves ontology, it involves Christology, right? It involves lots of different things. So when I can make the concession, for example, as an atheist, I can make the concession, well, okay, objective moral standards do exist, but that doesn't mean that they came from your God. Right? Now, the burden of proof is on me to prove that as the Christian. It is a whole lot longer, not harder, but longer to make the claim that the God of the Bible provides the objective moral framework if I don't understand the specific things about morality, right? And I don't understand their position. Because I can't turn around and say, well, the Bible, because they don't believe the Bible. You know what I'm saying? So that's why we're spending so much time on these things. Here's another important thing about the moral argument, right? Disagreement does not demonstrate that objective truth does not exist. Okay? Just because I don't accept that, the premise does not mean it's not true. We disagree about a lot of things, okay? We disagree about science. We disagree about history, theology, mathematics. What is the best football team? All of these different things. We disagree about them. But just because I don't believe it or I disagree with it does not make it untrue. This is something that you have to keep in the back of your mind when we talk about morality, because morality is objective. It's not subjective. It can feel subjective because we feel things, right? And it helps us understand morality. But morality itself is objective. There is one way that things are right and one way they are wrong. And God defines what is right and wrong. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, we're going to talk about that one a little bit more, but I want to move on to just a few other things that you might hear. Here are just some other arguments. We're not going to dive into these. But the ontological argument is the argument that begins with the idea that that creation has a reason to exist, and it's not just that God wanted it. All right, although some people will make that claim, but God gave purpose to things. For an example, you're all sitting on chairs, right? Chairs have a purpose. If you didn't understand the purpose of a chair, you would not use the chair correctly. We see that with little kids all the time, standing on them, knocking them over, doing all those things. Everything but their intended purpose. Okay, that's the ontological argument. The religious experience argument is basically just this premise that all throughout human history, religious experiences have happened, continue to happen, and we acknowledge them as important. Therefore, there must be a reason. Okay? Now we're going to talk about the problem of evil. I'm going to very much simplify this for the sake of time. So please do not take my words and go run out here and try and have a debate with somebody about this. This is something to whet your appetite a little bit, to give you a little bit of an understanding about it, and to think a bit more about it. So, this is the single oldest and probably most significant apologetic challenge in the belief of God. And the reason is this. Christianity makes specific claims about God, that he is omnipotent, he is omniscient, and he is perfectly good. The problem is that evil exists. So, how can all four of these things be true? This is the Epicurean trilemma in a nutshell. The idea that God is all good, he's all powerful, and he's all loving, but evil exists. So their claim is either God is not truly all loving, or evil would not exist, or he is too weak to stop all evil, therefore he's not all powerful. Okay? That is a very simple understanding of this question, and it is also an inaccurate one. Because there are multiple kinds of evil. All right? We talked about moral evil already. Murder, abuse, oppression, theft, war, deception, all of those things that offend our objective moral reality. Then there is natural evils. Tornadoes, twisters, wildfires, as we just talked about, diseases, floods, earthquakes. Those are what we consider to be natural evils. Here's the thing about natural evil, and this is the problem that people run into when we have this conversation. A tornado may kill somebody, but the tornado is not actually evil. It's just a tornado, right? We assign a moral imperative to the action because it offends our sensibility, right? And I want you to hear this, and I want you to understand this, right? Suffering, death, destruction, and deprivation can be associated with natural events, but ultimately they are not moral imperatives to the event, right? And this bothers us because we understand them to be bad things. But they're not inherently bad. They are amoral. They do not have a good or a bad attribute to them. They simply are, right? I cannot blame a weather event for taking my home just because it inconveniences me, right? In fact, if you read the book of Habakkuk, this is what Habakkuk talks about. It's 3 chapters. I recommend that you read it. But he talks a lot about this. Why am I suffering if you're here, God? That's what he literally opens his book with that, right? And what God shows him is that just because you're suffering does not mean I'm not here, right? Because your suffering does not equate objective moral evil. And that's a very hard thing for us to wrap our minds around. Because there are other things like physical evils, pain, sickness, bodily injury, disability, decay, and even death, right? We consider them to be evils, but they're not evils, right? They're a result of evil, right? They were the result of disobedience and the fall of man, but they're not inherently by themselves evil, at least in a moral sense, okay? And this brings us to the logical problem of evil. See, people will argue that God's existence and evil are contradictory based on these things, right? They will say that God is all-powerful and he's perfectly good, but evil exists, therefore God is incapable of dealing with evil, right? The problem is that these statements do not explicitly contradict each other in any way, shape, or form. Just because evil exists does not mean that God is all good, or that he is all-powerful, or that he is omniscient, right? They require another premise in order to actually fulfill the argument, okay? For example, a perfectly good and omnipotent being must eliminate every evil that it can eliminate. That is the presupposition that people talk about when they talk about moral evil. They assume that because God is all good, he must deal with suffering. That is an assumption. And it's one that we're very uncomfortable with. The reason that we're uncomfortable with it is because we assume that if God loved us, he would do something about it. But that's actually an assumption about how God loves, right? And it's actually a fallen assumption. We assume that we should not suffer. Why do we assume that? Because suffering is inconvenient. It's actually a form of selfishness to assume that you're not going to suffer, especially considering the fact that Christ specifically said to count it joy when you suffer for his sake, because you will suffer for his sake, right? Christianity does not promise us that life is going to get easier. In fact, it promises the opposite. But it also promises us a final restoration. Okay? So that is the beginning of the moral argument. The existence of evil does not by itself create a logical contradiction in the existence of an all-powerful, perfectly good God. Okay? The second thing is the evidential problem of evil. And this is where the slope gets slippery. Right? Because the evidential problem is not necessarily making the claim that all evil makes God impossible. What it's asking the question is, okay, well, if God is real, then why is there so much evil? Right? Two different claims. And it's very important because this is what people deal with. This is the big one. They like to try and stay in the logical problem, but the reality is they almost always shift into the evidential problem. And the reason they shift into the evidential problem is because this is actually where we hurt. Right? This is the unnecessary, random, unequally distributed, unnecessary wickedness that we deal with, right? That we see in the world. This is what we're talking about when we talk about the evidential evil. The important thing about this, and again, it's in the premise if you actually look at it, right? And this is why we ask what are they trying to bring into it? What is the premise? What is the assumption, right? There is a very important word in this argument. This is the formal argument of this is that even if God and evil could logically coexist, the amount, the intensity, and apparent pointlessness of suffering seem to count as evidence against the existence of an all-powerful, perfectly good God. The word there is apparent, right? Apparently. That is doing an extreme amount of heavy lifting and is smuggling in an entire worldview. Here's the thing about the word apparently. There is a difference between saying, I cannot see a reason for suffering, and therefore suffering shouldn't happen. Okay? And this is very important. When we have this argument, when people argue from the evidential base of morality, they are arguing from hurt. And what their basic premise always is I should not have experienced this. It's unfair. Right? That fundamentally denies basic attributes about God. Who is justice? Who is righteousness? What fair is defined by? Right? They're defining it by their experience. God is defining it by who he is. Right? And this one takes a considerable amount of understanding of a lot of different categories to really address properly, because you need to understand a few things. Human beings do not know a lot of context when it comes to these things. We do not know how every consequence factors into something, We do not know every person that was affected by it. We do not know the future consequences of the actions that are taken, right? We're finite beings. But when we make the claim that it should not happen because God exists, we are stepping into a mantle of authority in that area that we do not have and cannot operate in because we do not know. Okay? Our inability to identify God's reason for letting something happen, right, does not establish that God has no reason for letting it happen to begin with. So when we talk about the evidential evils of the world, we cannot really speak to it in the idea of God cannot exist because these things happen, because we don't know why they happen. Right? We live in a fallen world. Right? And that is the best argument that you can make for that. It's the best understanding of that kind of thing, is that the fact of the matter is the world is, it's fallen. And we live in that, and we exist in that, and we operate in it. Okay? And so we need to recognize that. Because the problem of evil does not actually create a serious problem for Christianity, but it does if you refuse to actually expound on it or ask the questions. For example, evil itself requires an explanation, right? And here's why. Because we understand where good comes from. Good comes from God, right? Scripture says that all perfect things come from him, right? He called creation good. Yet we understand that evil exists. Right? It wasn't there before it, right? So it has to have an explanation, right? And the existence of evil does raise the question for Christianity, but it does not actually affect the moral, objective truth that it exists, right? So it's more of a let's think about it and less of because it exists, God doesn't exist. Make sense? And we're actually going to talk about the next thing we're going to talk about with that is something they're called theodicies, right? And so what a theodicy is an attempt to make sense of God's reasoning to let something happen. Okay, so there's two kinds of apologetics. There's defenses and theodicies. A defense attempts to show that the objection raised against the Christian belief does not succeed. This is the baseline of apologetics. You bring up a point, I don't refute the point, I give you all the reasons why you're wrong. All right, a theodicy goes further, and I'm going to be very upfront with you. I do not like theodicies. The only reason that I'm expressing them to you is because you probably heard one or two of them. All right, but I think theodicies are a very poor apologetic. And the reason that I think they're a very poor apologetic is because theodicies try and account for God in a way that is human. Right? We try and put human understanding to what God is actually specifically claiming. Right? And so here are the major theodicies as we just kind of breeze through these real quick. The first one is free will. Alvin Plantinga does a great job on explaining free will. But here's the main process behind free will. We have free will, and we know that we have free will. Right? The fact that you can think proves that you have free will. Right? That being said, the theodicy will try and say that free will is the only reason that evil exists. And that's not true. Because it doesn't account for things like natural evil. It doesn't account for things like tornadoes or wildfires or things like that. Right? It's limited. The second one is the soul-making theodicy. The soul-making theodicy is basically the idea that the things that the Bible calls virtuous would not exist without evil. Right? So courage or perseverance or compassion or sacrifice even require, those things. They require suffering. They require fear. They require difficulty. They require giving up something. Okay? And so that's the soul-making theodicy. The problem with the soul-making theodicy is that not all suffering leads to growth. Sometimes we're just hurt. You don't get that job that you really need, right? You're struggling with a relationship that just, no matter what you do, it just seems like it hurts you, right? That's not a breeding ground for growth. It's just suffering, right? This one is my favorite one, and it's the only one I think you should pay attention to. It's the privation of good. We talked a little bit about explaining what good and evil is. This is, in my opinion, the best explanation for what evil is. Because it says that evil is not an independent created substance. Evil is the corruption, disorder, or deprivation of something good, right? For example, blindness is the deprivation of sight, right? Darkness is not the antithesis of light, it is the absence of light, all right? Decay corrupts what it cannot, it corrupts the natural order of things, but it does not create things, right? The privation of good is essentially the argument for evil. The evil is not created, it is just the inverse of what is good, right? And we understand this through the context of the fall, right? Well, when mankind fell, right, and the nature of reality became fallen, evil became a thing of substance, not because it had to be, but because what was good is no longer not being used for its intended purpose, right? Evil does not possess an independent creative existence. It does not have the ability to insist upon itself. It does not have the ability to create itself. Evil is the corruption of what God created as good, right? In fact, if you look at in the Hebrew, right, in Genesis 1 and 3, when he talks about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the words there are ram and torib, right, good and evil. And they are most clearly associated with moral good and moral evil. But what's very interesting is that the word for good actually means perfect. It means that it's perfect, complete, fulfills exactly what it's supposed to do. Torib, the word for evil, actually means made up with contempt or of little worth. Otherwise, the antithesis of perfect, right? I'm not saying that you should read it that way. I'm just saying it's very interesting that you can read it that way. Because evil is not the absence of good. It is good turned for the unintended purpose. The purpose that it was not designed to. Have you ever heard the old adage, hell is paved on a road of good intentions? That's exactly what we're talking about. You can do all the right things and do all the good things for the wrong reasons and produce evil instead of good. That's the privation of evil. The next one is the greater good approaches. This is my least favorite theodicy, and it's one that I do not think that you should ever use. The reason I'm exposing it to you is because you probably heard of it. This approach says that God may permit things to happen within creation that we do not fully understand because of the fact that it will produce something good in the end. Okay? The problem with this is this one actually contradicts a lot of Scripture. And it very quickly becomes this idea that everything happens for a reason. Right? That's not entirely true. When we say that God has a plan, we do not mean a mechanical, exhaustive plan for your life. Right? If you had that, you wouldn't have free will. Right? But what it can become is when bad things happen, we could just say, well, that was just part of God's plan. That's not true. God does not wish destruction on your life. He does not wish for you to die. If he did, he wouldn't have sent Jesus Christ. Okay? It's very important that you understand that because that is a very Calvinistic approach. It is a very, I would say, mentally stunted approach, not in the idea that it's bad, but it's not well thought out. Right? Because what that naturally does is allow you to attribute things to God that God cannot have. He cannot be evil. He cannot do bad things. Everything that God does is perfect. It's part of who he is. To attribute something that is evil to him and to say that he did it or he let it happen is actually a character issue with God. Right? It's not compatible with his character. In fact, there's this entire book in the Old Testament called Job that specifically talks about this thing. I'm going to harp on Job here for a little bit because I love Job. Job is one of my favorite books in the Bible, and the reason is because everybody in that room was right about something, but all of them missed it, even Job. All of his friends came and told him to the understanding of their knowledge, right, the things that they could know about God. You did something wrong. You had to have. And Job said, no, I didn't. And the truth was, no, he didn't. Right? But when God addresses him, he still tells Job this. He says, do not question what you're not meant to question. I love the way that he says it. He says, stand before me, oh man. Where were you at the beginning of the universe when I did all these things? Yeah. He's saying, I'm not accountable to you. Right? And we need to understand that when we talk about morality, when we talk about God in general, because we are accountable to God. He is not accountable to us. We are the creation, not the creator. Right? And that's the problem with that theodicy, in my opinion, is because it very quickly degrades to this idea of justifying bad things in God's name. Right? And it's a very bad thing to do. All right? So, the one last thing I want to talk about is the pastoral problem of evil. And this is the most practical application of this. This is the one thing I do want you to pay attention to. Not everyone who is asking the question, why did God allow this, is asking for a philosophical answer. In fact, they're almost never asking a philosophical answer. Please, 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 please do not take these theodicies or these apologetics and try and use them when somebody's father just passed away. Okay? Or when they're suffering. All right, that's not the purpose of apologetics. It's not the time and place for apologetics. there is a pastoral way to deal with evil, all right? And the wisdom in it is knowing which conversation you're having, okay? You do not want to use a solecism or an apologetic to try and confront somebody's hurt, all right? It's a big no-no. Please don't do that, because you might be intellectually true and emotionally devastating.
Right.
And that will turn somebody off from the truth far quicker than you just being wrong. Okay? Now, the answer to evil. We talked a lot about evil and different things. Here's the Christian answer to evil. And it's actually very simple. It's Jesus Christ. Okay? Christianity's first and final response to evil is not a philosophical system. It's not just an apologetic. It's not knowing why God allowed something to happen. It is Jesus Christ. It is knowing that what Jesus said he was going to do, he did and is coming back to do again. All right? Christ, and this is what's so important when we talk about Christ and his humanity, right? Because he experienced grief. He experienced rejection. He understands what it means to be betrayed. He understands injustice. He understands sexual malpractice. He understands pain, and he understands death. Right? And at the cross, he confronted all of that. Right? In the resurrection, he defeated death. And at his ascension, he promised that he was coming back to do it again. Right? Christianity does not promise that we will understand why everything happened, but it does promise that God has done something about it, and that evil is not going to have the final word in our lives. Okay? So the truth claim, the big thing for that, if you want to keep it in your pocket, is the Christian response to evil is ultimately rests not in our ability to explain every instance of suffering, but in the crucified and risen Christ who promised the final defeat of evil. All right? So when somebody says, well, how do you explain these kind of things? You can confidently say, I don't have an answer for that. I don't know why God let these things happen. I don't know why he chose to do things the way that he chose to do them. But I also don't have to, because it's not important. Right? I mean, you guys all have kids, right? You understand the concept of sometimes you just have to tell your child, because I said so. Right? And it's true. Because sometimes because I said so is the answer. Right? So when we talk about things like apologetics, that is also a very valid answer, because that's just the way things are. All right? It's not a cop-out, and you don't ever use it lazily, but you do use it when you need to be honest about something. Right? Because somebody may accept the cosmological argument. They may accept the teleological argument. They may even grant you some aspects of your moral argument. But the question becomes, have we proven Christianity? And the answer is no. At the most, you've moved them towards an idea of theism, right? The idea that God maybe exists out there in some way, shape, or form, right? So, what do we do with that? Well, it's the reason that apologetics is a toolbox, and it's not the main point of the classes that we've been talking about. Because then we go back into the things we've talked about. We go back to the Gospels, and we explain who Jesus is. We go back to God and his character and nature, right? We go back to our worldview, and we rely on that. There's two specific apologetics that speak to these things, and I saved them for last. And they're some of my favorite things to talk about. And the first one is the resurrection. I don't know if you know this, but the resurrection is actually an apologetic. It's quite possibly the best apologetic that you're ever going to deal with. And the reason is because it's verifiable, right? And Paul makes this very clear in 1 Corinthians 15. He says that if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then we are to be fools without pity, right? And the reason for it is very simple, because if Christ is not raised from the dead, then our faith is meaningless. But there is a substantial apologetic for the idea of the resurrection. It is actually, there is more evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ that we have than to prove that George Washington existed. Think about that for a second. Somebody who was only alive like 250 years ago, mind you, has less evidence, less historical data attributed to him, less eyewitness accounts and verified testimonies than the resurrection of Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago. Okay? So, this is called the minimalist case for the resurrection. And I'm not going to go into this too deeply, but the minimalist case for the resurrection is the basic things that everyone can accept about the premise of Jesus Christ. And that is this, that Jesus Christ was a Jew, and he was murdered on a cross, right, by the Roman government at the behest of the Jews. The second thing is that he was taken down from the cross after being verified dead right? They drove the spear through his side, right? He was dead. The Romans knew how to kill people. Nobody's going to deny that. The third thing is that he was in the tomb on Friday, and on Sunday he wasn't there. The fourth thing is they never found his body. And yet, multiple eyewitness accounts across different historical traditions have said they have seen Jesus Christ in a resurrected form. The fifth thing, all 12 apostles died for this. Let me tell you something that's very interesting. Nobody dies for a lie. Nobody. You might say that, oh, I would, or you don't know that. No, I do. And here's why. Watergate happened. Watergate put 12 of the most powerful men in the entire world together, and they couldn't keep their story straight for 3 weeks. Right? The disciples, and later the apostles, right, of the same name, with the exception of Matthias, who they brought in, right, they kept their story straight all the way to the point of death. And I'm not talking about they just casually died. Every one of them, except for John, was executed, and John was boiled in oil and exiled to the Isle of Patmos. All right? They did not die for a lie. Okay? So, that's the minimalist case for the resurrection. I would love to spend some more time talking about that, and I might do that if I ever get the chance to preach in the life of Christ. But Christian apologetics points us to the fact that God exists, and we have a historical claim that God has revealed himself in Jesus Christ, and that Jesus Christ was risen from the dead, right? And we have those things. So, what does that leave us with? Other than a whole lot of things that you hope that you never actually have to use, because it makes your head hurt when you think about it. The first thing and the most important thing you can do with apologetics is use apologetics to question yourself as a believer, right? This is the foundation of apologetics beyond everything else, right? You take the things that you've learned and you apply them to your life first. You ask the questions, why am I a Christian? Were you a Christian because you grew up in church, because your parents were Christian, or because you believe? Did you have an experience, and are you continuing to experience? Right? Apologetics helps us answer those questions, right? What is that dude's name? Socrates. Socrates is my favorite Greek philosopher, and the reason is specifically because he asks this one question. And he asks the question, is an unexamined life worth living? And he says no. What's very interesting is that people didn't like Socrates because he was always asking questions, right? But if we're not actually asking questions, if we're not engaging our brain, we're missing out on a fundamental way to witness to people, right? Not everybody is just going to believe things because you say them. Some people have to be convinced. That's why Peter tells us to have a defense for our faith, right? We understand that we have to have a specific temperament. We have to have a specific way that we're doing this because we're not arguing with people. You will never win somebody to the Lord via an argument. I don't necessarily believe that. I believe that you will never win somebody to the Lord with a bad argument. Okay? Because there are a great number of very intellectual people that had become Christians because of the arguments that were presented to them. One of the foremost theologians of the 21st century was C.S. Lewis. And you know how he became a Christian? He wasn't rejoicing, he was cursing. He was in his room by himself screaming at the Lord, and he was mad because he realized that God existed. And he wasn't happy about it because he realized that meant he had to change. Right? So, and if he can do it and become the foremost apologist of the 20th century, writing things like Mere Christianity and the Screw Tape Letters and all these different things that show us a great way to understand these different arguments, then I think we can do it too. All right? Does anybody have any questions? Thoughts, concerns? Yes.
So, like, would it be fair to say that, like, consequences are not evil, which is like the sum of past evil or sin? But I know that leaves out the tornadoes.
I'm sorry, what?
Is it kind of fair to be, like, say that consequences aren't, like, say you're talking to somebody, and then, you know, all of a sudden they're trying to, like, they're asking a question like, well, you know, why is there evil? That kind of a question.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what I mean? If you're trying to separate it categorically, like, consequences aren't evil. Like, the act of, you know, sin. You know what I mean? Like, how do you go down?
Yeah, okay, I think I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
So there's two parts to that. First, we need to understand the assumption that they're trying to make, right? And so the question is well, why are you asking that question? And furthermore, what do you mean by consequences? Right? Because the consequences for your actions are not inherently evil. Right? If I knock my laptop over and it hits the ground, it's not evil, although I might curse the ground, right, for what it did to my laptop, but that doesn't make it evil, right? But that doesn't mean that the action preceding it was good. For example, I might have been doing it because I was mad, right? That's not a good thing, right? Does it make it evil? Not really. Now, there's also how people react to consequences. For example, if my little guy knocks something over and I get mad at him and I start throwing stuff, right, that consequence is not deserving of the action, is it? No, it's not, right? It's my sinful nature revealing itself in a way that I need to take before the Lord, right? So consequences can have moral attributes to them, but it's because we assign them, not because they inherently have them. That's the problem with natural evil in general, is we assign moral attributes to them, and they don't necessarily predicate them, and they don't necessarily need them.
Do you think tornadoes are evil?
No.
Okay, that answers that question.
No. Tornadoes are just a natural response to natural weather patterns that God created. Now, does that mean that the trailer park that gets upended and the people that die is evil? No. I do think it's a tragedy, but it's not evil, right? Now, if I was up there and I decided to, use my Tornado 5000 to make tornadoes, then it would be evil. Yeah. Any other questions? Thoughts, comments, concerns, theological discourses you want to open in the 20 minutes that we've already went over?
Yeah.
All right, well, I appreciate you guys. I hope that you got something out of this. I would love to talk about this more in depth if you ever have any questions. Just understand that this is very dense, and it's not as easy as, here's the answer. All right, apologetics is never, here's the answer. Apologetics is, here are answers that build up the case, okay? Next week, we're going to be wrapping up this series, and we're going to be talking about what do we do with all this stuff. We're going to do a little bit of hands-on things, and we're also going to just talk about what it means to practice the Christian faith, all right?